Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the ASX and Sectors weekly chart analysis for the week ending 21st of March 2025. First chart is the XJO. This is the S&P ASX 200 index, the parent index for the Australian Stock Exchange. You can see over the last 4 weeks the market's broken down. It's pushed lower. It's been quite a strong pullback. And this week we've seen some buying support emerge. You can actually see in the pullback overall, if I clear that, the weakness emerged up here in the first place, and there was a pullback in response. I don't think the market really wanted to pull back here. It was responding because overseas markets were pulling back, and to some degree it's forced to do so. There was a reluctance to continue lower here, and even an attempt to push higher in response. And then the market knew that the pullback was on and price really thrust lower here. Spread reduced on this bar and volume increased. That showed you that buying support had emerged. Even though off the lows that week, there wasn't a great deal of buying support obvious. Just the fact that the spread narrowed compared to the previous bar, but volume increased, has to tell you that buying support was taking place in the market. And in response, the market's pushed higher this week. So you've got some accumulation going on down here in this little range here. Now that may continue for a little bit longer, or the market may attempt to push higher immediately. We'll have to wait and see. But there's been some buying support, at least over the last 2 weeks. That's obvious. Now, you'll see this same pattern on many of the charts today, so I'll skim through it a bit. But you've had 4 weeks of pushing lower and then 1 week of buying support. This is the mid-cap sector. You can see the same sort of setup here, although the buying support off the lows 2 weeks ago was much more obvious and the push higher in response was reduced. But you've got that same buying support coming in overall. This is the small ordinaries, similar to the mid-caps in some degree. You can see obvious buying support off the lows down here. Much stronger push higher this week, possibly completing the reversal to some degree, which would come through here, and the market just popped out the top. Perhaps a little bit of over-enthusiasm this week when it became obvious that demand had come back into the market, people piling in and perhaps not paying so much attention to the price levels, and the market's got a little bit ahead of itself just here, or a little bit ahead of the rest of the market. This is the financials. This is the largest sector by quite some way. You can see that the stretch lower is much reduced in this sector compared to the S&P ASX 200 index, which really stretched lower. You can really noticeably see that spread narrowed 2 weeks ago, and volume, while it was reduced, remained above average. And this week you've got buying support coming in, which is the same across most of the market. And this is the little area here we're looking at. We're expecting that to continue to some degree. It'll either be a push higher or a push sideways, I imagine. This is the metals and mining subsector, and price broke down here. There's a little bit of buying support come in. Price broke down again. There was a push up to the breakdown line here, which failed. Price pulled back, built up some strength again. There's definite buying support in here, and prices pushed higher this week. The very high volume, and you'll notice on some of the other charts as well, the very high volume was to do with options and futures expiry day today, and it was the end of the quarter for them as well. So it's always a little higher again. If you pull back and look at the daily chart, you'll see this really high volume, and that's to do with the options and futures expiry day, and that's a feature across the whole of the market. today on the ASX. It's certainly more obvious in some sectors than others, but a very high volume needs to be investigated because that wasn't all traded on market. You can see this market has had some buying support emerge over the past 2 weeks in here, and there's been a response higher. The important level is there at the moment, and you've got the level goes through here, the longer term level. So there's your overhead resistance. A break above that would be significant, at least in the near term. This is the ASX gold market. Price continued to push higher this week, spread narrowed considerably. It appears though that volume was really, really high, and that would suggest that selling pressures come in, but that's not the case. This very high volume was to do with the options and futures expiry day. You'll probably find that volume was actually slightly reduced this week and would balance more with the narrower spread this week. If we have a look, you'll see what I mean. Here's the daily chart, and there's the very, very high volume, mostly to do with the options and futures expiry day and the end of their quarter. And you can see that most of the volumes were slightly elevated, but relatively modest overall. And what you can see here is some pretty obvious bullish absorption taking place. So you've got a pressing nature towards the upside. You've got threatening down bars, which see no downside follow through. And you see clusters of closes at a similar level like this. These are all a feature of bullish absorption. It does look much more like bullish absorption than any sort of weakness has come in. Well, actually, if you looked at that on raw data, you'd say this huge volume here, if that was all traded on market, could only produce a down bar that only pushed down as low as halfway through the previous bar. There was huge buying support in there. So even that wouldn't suggest that selling pressure has emerged, which it hasn't anyway. Let's back to the weekly chart again. And what we actually just showed was that the market is doing some bullish absorption through here like this, which is quite strong, and there's no problems. There's no obvious problems in this market. This is the energy sector. The energy sector has broken down. Here is your breakdown line. You can choose which one you'd like to use. They're both valid. They sort of form like a zone of resistance above. Price broke down 3 weeks ago. Buying support immediately came in last week. There's been a small push higher in response, but until this market proved it was strong enough to push back above this breakdown line, this market is under pressure, and that's to be as nice as possible. It's under pressure, and it would really need to prove that it's got some underlying strength now before you'd really want to take the long side. And that would be done by a push through this breakdown line. More likely, if price comes up to it, it will fail, and it'll either go sideways through here or it'll push lower again. We'll just wait and see how things develop. This is the healthcare sector. The healthcare sector broke down before the market did overall. Lows of the range originally came through here, and price started to push higher. It did look as though the market was going to make an attempt to break out up here. The overall market pulled back over 4 weeks, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the overall market started having its weakness here. This market had already begun to break down. Here is your breakdown line here. This is the last gasp lows, and prices pushed below that on this bar and broken down. There was some reluctance to move lower here for a little bit, and then price has thrust lower in what might prove to be some form of shakeout down here. We'll see. But at this point, the market has broken down. There's been some modest buying support emerge this week, which has happened across the whole broad market on the ASX. So we'll just see what happens. This week's trading was inside the previous bar's range. The very high volume was to do with options and futures expiry. So don't get too excited about that. I would expect that the volume was average or slightly below average this week, but we'll see. This is the industrials market, which has been really on a bit of a tear lately, ever since down here when we identified that there was a reluctance to move lower and then a breakout here. We've been following this one through. It's been pretty obvious. The market's been trading very nicely. It's been easy to understand. Price pushed up here. Weakness started to emerge here, but mainly in response to the broader weakness on the ASX 200, the parent index. This market itself wasn't really very weak, and you can see that over the first 3 weeks of the pullback, this market hardly pulled back at all. It was really reluctant to pull back. And then when it really did pull back, immediately on this week's bar, buying support emerged, and you've had price push up higher in response. So there's been a recovery in here like this. So this market's been reluctant to break down. It's only done so because the rest of the market has, and to some extent it's forced to do so as well. But because the pullback has been so shallow in comparison to the broader market, it's giving you a clear indication that it's relatively strong. And if the market regains its strength, this market will really push high with some vigour. This is the consumer staples sector. Often benefits when there's weakness in the market. As can be seen, when the first week of the pullback happened on the broader markets, this market was higher, and it even intended on going higher immediately, but the weakness then became apparent and it pulled back again. Here's the lows of the range. Here's the last gasp lows. You can see price pulled back to that level, tested this, and has seen buying support emerge this week. And overall, we're pretty much back where we started from, which is in this big sideways pattern in here. And that's where the market's traded. So no damage done overall, just normal fluctuations that you would see as the market responds to forces that it has no control over. This is consumer discretionary, and this market has pulled back. Once again, perhaps not as strongly as the overall market. It's been reluctant to pull back. It's done so because it really has to some degree. It would be very, very risky to try to stand in there and hold the whole market up while the rest of the markets are coming down, especially if they continued lower and we had a serious pullback, because then you'd be stuck at the highs holding all this stock and sending your company or yourself broke. So the markets are forced to pull back, at least to some degree. You can see that the weakness did emerge here. There was a reluctance to move higher here. Price pulled back. Relatively narrow spread. Spread increased. Buying support came in off this bar, but only modest here. And then you've had a response this week similar to the broader market. But this market has shown a reluctance to move lower. This is the property sector. The property sector has broken down. We'll have to see how it responds as time goes on. The breakdown line will come through here. You could draw it off that line as well if you preferred. So it gives like a little zone of resistance above. This is the breakdown bar here. There was a reluctance to continue lower there. Buying support came in on this bar, and the response to the buying support has seen price push up this week. So you've got some buying come in pretty much through there like that. To prove itself as being strong again, it really needs to push above this breakdown zone. So you might see price push up to this level, and then what happens is important. If it can push through, it's proving it's got underlying strength building in the market. If it's unable to break through and it pulls back, then there's not so much strength, but it's not particularly weak, but a push back below this level, like that, would suggest a really serious breakdown is going to begin. So watch what happens in response, especially at this breakdown level here, this breakdown zone. And just to show you, here's the Dow Jones, and show you how the markets are following the overseas markets. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the bar that really saw the pullback on the ASX. But look back a few bars. Here's where the real weakness emerged. Up to here, price is doing a good job breaking out up to the previous highs. On this bar, you've got a mid-bar close on pretty high volume, and then an attempt to consolidate, and then a very narrow spread up bar on very low volume. There's no demand in the market here. The market's looking like it could be cooked. And then the next bar, price breaks down, an inability to recover, and then a secondary breakdown here. There was some buying support emerge, and that may have been some preliminary buying, but then a real thrust lower in a shakeout style, and immediately buying support has emerged, which is what happened in our market as well. And this week so far has seen the response to the buying support and the push higher. So it's almost identical to our local market, apart from the fact we can see 2 bars earlier, or 2 weeks earlier, 6 weeks ago, where the actual weakness in the US market emerged from. And it took 3 weeks for it to work its way through before the breakdown bar happened. And if you go back now and look at the local market, you can see that same thing. Here's the 1, 2, 3, 4 bars where the weakness emerged, and here's the bars earlier. We don't actually have a great deal of weakness obvious in our market because I don't think it really was going to break down here. We saw the consolidation, same as the US market, then an attempt to push higher, and on that bar, the US market saw no demand. We didn't see that here, and that's because we weren't really going to push lower, but then the market overseas broke down, so we responded in a similar fashion. A reluctance to break down here, a continuation, and then the buying support came in down here on this bar. And that's the response to the buying support this week, and we'll see what happens next week in response. I expect early on you'll get some testing for supply. That's generally what happens. If the US market goes on a tear straight away, well, we might push higher as well. But generally you'll see some testing for supply, which may go on for some time, or you may just see that early in the week and then the market attempts to push higher in response. You'll probably find there's some difficulties up at this level here, where these 2 bars overlap to some degree. Here, it's only a minor level, but you might find there's some difficulty there. But apart from that, it's fairly straightforward until you get up to this level here. Up above this level here in this zone, there may be some resistance as well. Okay, thanks for your time. Enjoy your weekend. See ya.